In this lesson, let's create a test for the activity item component. This component is responsible for showing individual activity items on activities page. And we'll start testing this component with checking that it has delete button. So let's duplicate one of the existing tests, called the new test file activityitem.test.ts. And in the first testing scenario, I'm gonna check that activity item component has delete button. Now let's open up activity item component and find in the template where that button is rendered. It is represented by base button component. So we can check that it has a proper type as well as proper icon, which in this case is a trash icon. Before writing any expectations, let's firstly mount the component by using mount function. We have to import activity item component, and then I'm going to print out the whole rendered markup of this component in the terminal. And right away we're seeing an error. That is because we are trying to read the property name on the activity object, which is undefined. Because if we'll go back to activity item component, here we're seeing that we're getting this activity object as a prop, but in our test, we haven't yet passed this activity object into the component during rendering. So we need to specify additional argument to this mount function where we can choose which props we wanna pass. In this case, I'm going to pass prop with the name activity. Here I'm going to define an activity object by specifying all necessary fields. And to know which fields activity object has to contain, we can open up types.ts module. This is the module where all our types are defined. Right here we're seeing that the activity object consists of identifier, name, and seconds to complete properties. So all these properties I'm going to specify in this object. And values of those properties do not matter for now. So let's assign empty values. And now at least we're seeing that the component has been successfully rendered, and we do not have any errors. We are also seeing the rendered markup of the component. So now it's time to write our first expectation, where we're going to check that this component has button of the danger type with the proper icon. So let's go back to the test and write an expectation. I'm going to firstly find the component by its name, called base button. Because we're checking that deletion button is present, first of all, we will check that this button has proper type, and the type for base component button we specify as a prop with the name type. So I'm going to compare the value of this prop with the danger button type that we can get by referencing button type enumeration, which also has to be imported in this file. The second expectation will be used to check that button has proper icon, and the icon is represented by another component called base icon, which also has prop called name, where we can specify which icon we'd like to show. In this case, the icon should have a name trash. And after this, if we will switch over to the terminal and check test results, sure enough, it will be passing. But the moment I'm going to modify something related to this base button component, let's say we're gonna use success button type instead of a danger, right away the test is going to fail, because we expect that the deletion button will have danger type. In the next testing scenario, we're going to check the functionality of this button and what is going to happen after we click on it. So after clicking this button, corresponding activity has to be removed. And in terms of the implementation, when we click on the button, the delete and reset activity function will be called. That in turn is going to call a couple of other functions. So we can verify that these two functions will be called after we're gonna click on the delete button. And at this moment we are not really interested what the result of those two function executions will be, because we are unit testing this activity item component, and it is enough for us that those two functions will be called after we click on the delete button. So we are testing the delete button along with delete and reset activity handler in isolation. Now I'm going to duplicate this existing test, change the description. I'll say it deletes activity. Let's comment out these two expectations. The logic for rendering the component will stay the same. And in here, we have to perform an action, which will be clicking on the delete button. So first of all, let's find the button by using find method, and then click it by calling trigger method like this. And just because we are verifying that this click will lead to two other functions being called, these two functions are imported from other modules, so I'm going to add an import for both of these modules in our testing file, group all the exports of timeline items module under timeline items name, like so. And we also need to import another module where the second function that we are interested in is coming from. So I'm grouping all the exports of activities module under activities name. And now by using the familiar technique, we can easily write spies for both of those functions. The first spy will be spying on reset timeline item activities function, which is exported from timeline items module. And then let's create another spy for delete activity function. This function is imported from activities module. So now we have done all necessary preparation in order to write expectations against these two spies. So let's check that reset timeline item activities function will be called once, as well as that it will be called with proper arguments. In the original implementation, we're seeing that this function is being called with two arguments, timeline items reactive variable and the activity object. But there is a little problem because currently we do not have access to the activity object. So let's just skip the second expectation for now and write expectations against the second spy. The delete activity function has also to be called once. At this point, the test is passing. Now let's restore all mocks that have been created during this test by calling restore all mocks method. And now we have to somehow get access to this activity object that we are passing into the component as a prop. Since this object is being passed into the component as a prop, we can easily extract this object and put it in the constant, so we can also have access to this object after the component is rendered. And that's what we're going to do. I'm going to create an activity constant, extract this object in here, and now we have all required information in order to check that both spies have been called with proper arguments. The reset timeline item activities spy receives activity object as the second argument. And as the first argument, it receives reactive array of timeline item objects. This array is imported from timeline items module. We already have an import for this module, so we can easily get access to timeline items array via this module. The module name is called timeline items, just like the timeline items array, and that is why we're using timeline items name in here twice. First one references the module, and the second name references an array. And the test is still passing. At the end, we'll add one more expectation to check that delete activity function also receives expected argument, which is activity object that we receive as a prop into this component. So right here I'm gonna add the second expectation for delete activity spy and say that this function has to be called with the activity object that we have passed into the component during rendering as a prop. And the test is still green, but if I'm not going to click on the logo, none of those functions will be called, and our spy checks will fail. The test is going to throw an error. Or for example, if we're not going to call any of those functions in this listener, we're also going to get the test failing, because in this case, the second spy expectation is going to fail. And that's about it for this test. Finally, I'm going to group the logic in this test. So we clearly see 3 stages: preparation, action, and expectations. As always, let's do a quick check and run all tests in the project. We are ready to move on to the next lesson.